Everything old is new again, and nowhere is Groundhog Day more alive and well than the Star Wars merchandising arm. Micro vehicles are back. As frustrating as Hasbro has been lately with the Star Wars license, there is a new player in town. Jazwares has introduced the Micro Galaxy Squadron, and it is bringing back the concept of micro-scaled vehicles. For those of you who have collected Star Wars for any amount of time, you'll know that this is not a new idea. This goes all the way back to the early 80s with Kenner's Micro Collection, which we chronicled in one of our episodes of Star Wars Follies. And then in the 90s, Galoob tried it first with Micro Machines, and then they did the Action Fleet, which is far more in line with what Jazwares is trying to do. Clearly, this is inspired by Galoob's Action Fleet, and they're trying to up the ante on that. But how did they do? I freely admit I have never been a massive fan of micro-scaled vehicles and toys. It's a frustration for me. I know that there are people who are devoted to miniaturizing toys, environments, vehicles. They really love the idea of seeing how small yet detailed something can get. Whereas I'm more of the opinion, at 3 3/4 inch scale, I'm good with all of it. I like that scale because it's big enough to easily interact with, but small enough that you can still get play environments, vehicles, and world build. The micro collection idea, the micro scaling idea, it's impressive as a desk piece, it's impressive as a curio, but it hasn't ever caught on with me. I bought the micro collection as a kid to get the Bespin freeze chamber, as I told you years ago, and that was really about it. I didn't foray into it beyond that because it wasn't as fun to play with. In the 90s, I bought a number of Galoob Action Fleet vehicles because I liked the way they were designed and the level of detail that went into them. However, I bought them as dorm room decor. I did not buy them to really play with them. They were more of like, hey, I've always wanted a really detailed model of the X-Wing fighter that I didn't have to build and paint. This is perfect. I'll put it on my desk next to my computer. And while the Galoob Action Fleet was a major step up from the Kenner Micro Collection in terms of the detail that went into the vehicles, there was a major drawback, and that was Galoob scaled all the vehicles to the size of the standard box. So your Millennium Falcon, your Snowspeeder, your X-Wing, your AT-AT Walker, your A-Wing, your Slave One, they all had to fit in that standard box, which meant they were all wildly out of scale with one another. In addition, the action figures weren't very fun. They were just micro-sized bonus prizes that were in the box, and they bent at the waist, and that was about it. You couldn't do anything with them except throw them in the vehicles where they're sort of intended to go and hope for the best. But the Galoob Action Fleet had one major draw. Like I said, that was the displayability of the vehicles themselves. Galoob made sure to include a display stand with all of their vehicles, and that really increased the curb appeal of these for anybody just wanting to casually buy their favorite starship from the Star Wars trilogy. The Kenner Micro Collection, on the other hand, was an early 80s concept which was all about playability for kids, so the vehicles, while not scaling completely correctly, were a lot closer than the Action Fleet, and they built in all of the blow-apart gimmicks and everything like that to keep kids entertained. Meanwhile, the die-cast figurines were completely immovable and just as frustrating to play with as the Galoob Action Fleet figures would be about 15 years later. So where does that leave Jazwares' Micro Galaxy Squadron in the history of Star Wars micro-scaled vehicles? It's somewhere in between. It's got the playability and it's got the scaling accuracy of the Kenner Micro Collection, but it has the curb appeal and detail levels of the Galoob Action Fleet, while also lacking some of its best features. As far as immediate impact when first encountering them, Jazwares has done a stellar job doing perfect window boxes to really show off these vehicles, both their scale and their detail. Unfortunately, when you get these vehicles out of their boxes, you will find there are no display stands of any kind, which you might think, well, there's no obligation of a toy company to provide a display stand, but I'm gonna get to why that's an issue here in a minute. And as far as that scaling is concerned, it is hit and miss. For example, the X-Wing, TIE Fighter, and Millennium Falcon all seem to be generally the right scale. I would argue it's possible the X-Wing is a little too small, but maybe not by much. The Slave One, on the other hand, it's way out of proportion with the Millennium Falcon. This Slave One vehicle and its Jango Fett counterpart, which is right here on the table, way too big to my eye compared to the Millennium Falcon. The quality of the builds on these vary. The TIE Fighter with removable wings is very solid. It's a nice detailed little piece. In many ways, it might be the nicest one in the whole group. Although, when you look at the Slave One has some really nice deco on it. It's got some great detail. It looks great sitting still on a shelf. Its fin system, it's just more of a gravity-fed kind of gimmick. It doesn't really have any mechanism behind it. It's just, okay, they're this way, and now they're this way when you lift the ship up. That's not a slam, it's just lower your expectations going in. The level of detail that went into the look of the ships did not go into the mechanism for that ship. The Micro Galaxy Squadron X-Wing is probably the worst of the bunch in terms of build quality. It's all very loosey-goosey and just kind of slapped together. It doesn't have the tight tolerances for the S-foils that the Galoob Action Fleet X-Wing had. So the fuselage is always slopping around, and the S-foils don't like to stay up in the right position. They kind of droop. And then you have this well-intentioned system they designed to remove R2-D2 easily from the astromech droid slot. The problem is that even though you have this great button to push up the fuselage underneath him to get him out of there, he doesn't stay in very well anyway. So if you were to barrel roll the X-Wing, R2 falls halfway out of it to begin with. So you don't really need that button at all because the R2 unit isn't tightly enough in there to make a difference. You have some great thought put into the interior of the Slave One, such as the lowering ramp and the rear cargo area with the weapons rack, that you can remove the tiny figurine's jetpack and put on that rack so that he can sit in the pilot seat of the Slave One. However, just like the Hasbro Vintage Collection Slave One, you are disappointingly faced with a ramp that is a bridge to nowhere, and then you have to open up a second door to get into that rear cargo compartment. Not since the original Slave One vehicle from Kenner has there been a version that has a continuous interior throughout. In terms of the interior design and overall play features, the Millennium Falcon is probably your best bet. It has a great detailed interior of the original ship. It's got amazing light and motion-activated sound effects. It has the lowering access ramp, and it has the rotating gun turret. The Micro Galaxy Squadron Falcon even has 4 seats in the cockpit to accommodate the 4 included figurines, and they've taken this into account by slightly upscaling the cockpit as compared to the rest of the ship. What's weird about the figures they chose for the Falcon, they picked Han Solo, Chewbacca, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Princess Leia. Princess Leia and Obi-Wan Kenobi never shared screen time in the original film, and all of the characters are based on their original film looks. So it would have made more sense to include Luke Skywalker so you could have filled out that cockpit with the proper figurines. But Jazwares apparently said, nope, we gotta get Princess Leia in here somewhere, so we'll put her in the Falcon set. And for anybody who wants Luke Skywalker, they can get him in his X-Wing gear with the X-Wing fighter. Little bit of a disappointment, doesn't really make a lot of sense, so there's no real scene you can put together with that. It's a letdown. In addition, all of the detail and thought put into the interiors of these vehicles, apparently to give the figures something to do, doesn't seem to be very well thought out in terms of the figures themselves. They're very much like the Galoob Action Fleet figures. They're very small. They're smaller than the Galoob Action Fleet figures, in fact, and they don't have much playability. They're so tiny, you're always dropping them. You can barely get them into their seats. There's not much they're going to do inside the interiors of the ships besides rattle around. They don't have any weapons they can hold. They're really not fun to play with. So I don't understand why they were included at all at this scale. It's like they took the scale of the vehicles and bumped it up a little bit for certain models, like the Falcon and the Slave One versus Action Fleet. They took the TIE Fighter and the X-Wing and scaled them down from Action Fleet and scaled down all the figurines accordingly to the point that they are frustrations rather than enjoyable elements of the toys. It took me 15 minutes to get Boba Fett and Fennec into the cockpit of the Slave One, and once I finally got them secured in their little seats, I thought, I'm never going to pull these guys out of here again. I'm never going to try and do that. Why? What am I going to do? They could get lost on my fingertip. There's no point to these figurines. They are really annoying to play with, or interact with, I guess you would say. Once you get them sort of where they need to go, they just need to stay there. Princess Leia is still unable to sit in her seat in the Falcon cockpit. She just rattles around. You turn the Falcon any which way but loose, and the next thing you know, Princess Leia is all over the cockpit, probably with 50 broken bones. On top of that, the Millennium Falcon's landing gear setup is really poorly designed. The Falcon is always flopping back over onto its belly because all of these long-hinged landing gear assemblies just close inadvertently when you shift the Falcon in any given direction. And this is why I said at the start of this video that it is a real shame these did not come with display stands, because they would have served these toys so well. These vehicles look great. They're the best looking micro-scaled vehicles Star Wars has ever come up with. And yet at the same time, there's no effective way to display them because their landing gears don't work very well, and that's not very dynamic anyway. They really need some flight stands that Galoob's Action Fleet provided all those years ago. But Jazwares totally missed the boat on that, instead giving us figurines that we can barely do anything with, when what we really want are some great ways to display these on our desks. And I know that hearing me say that, you might want to say, well, that's an adult want, not a child's want. Display stands sound like an adult thing. On the one hand, that's a fair thing to say, but on the other hand, I was a kid with toys that had display stands where I could remove them, and it was a lot of fun to be able to put them back on that display stand and put it back on my shelf after I got done playing with it. Kind of gave me a little sense of pride knowing where it was, knowing how cool it looked. They could have done that with these. That was one of the best innovations the Action Fleet from Galoob introduced into the history of micronized Star Wars toys. They should have listened to that, because this would have really helped this line a lot. If you're an adult collector and you want these, keep them in the box, because in the box is the best way to display them, sadly. With the build quality being kind of slipshod on some of the examples and no way to dynamically put them in a display case or on a shelf, leaving them in the boxes is your best bet. It's not like you're going to want to play with the action figures anyway. And I don't know how a kid would even play with them. I know I keep coming back to that, but these figures are really bad. But here's the deal. A lot of you guys hear me make objective observations and you think I'm just some kind of hater. These are the best looking micro-scaled Star Wars vehicles that have ever been produced, like I just said. They really do look great. That's why I went out and bought 5 of them. I wanted to see what they were all about. I wanted to really like these, and in some aspects, I really do. I really like the Falcon vehicle. I think it looks great. The X-Wing vehicle looks great until you handle it, even though it does feel, like I said, a little undersized maybe, especially when you're putting it next to the Slave One. I wish there was another way to interact with these through display stands. That would have been the icing on the cake. But as it is, they're very impressive on the shelf when you see them in stores. Once they're out of the box, though, I have a little bit of buyer's remorse. A little bit. I wish they had done display stands for these. I know I've said it like 10 times already, but it's such a miss on this line. You can feel and see the effort that went into them, but you can also feel and see sort of the misguided areas, like the size of the figurines, the build quality, no display stands. It was almost like you were almost there, and then swing and a miss.